You know that feeling when you dive into a subject you thought you understood, only to find the reality is, well, far more intricate and surprising? That's exactly where we're headed today. We're embarking on a deep dive into the foundational years of independent India, specifically challenging some widely accepted narratives about its first prime minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, and the complex nation he helped guide. Our essential guide for this journey is Taylor C. Sherman's compelling book, Nehru's India, A History in 7 Myths, our goal. To peel back these layers of myth, unearth the often surprising facts, and offer you, a clear pathway to being genuinely well-informed about a truly pivotal era in global history. This isn't your average textbook recap. This is where the real understanding begins.
Yeah, it's remarkable, really, how much of what we perceive about Nehru's India has been shaped by simplified stories or incomplete historical records. This deep dive should illuminate the intricate web of decisions, challenges, and, well, the ground realities that truly define those initial decades.
Right. When we envision Nehru, it's often as this towering, singular figure, almost single-handedly steering India after independence. That image is certainly reinforced in popular culture, like the films division of India's Film Nehru, which gives him the sole voice, seemingly isolating him from all other perspectives.
That portrayal indeed aligns with what some early biographers suggested, that he governed almost entirely alone, unapproachable, and unchallenged. Even the monumental selected works of Jawaharlal Nehru, despite now being 85 volumes, primarily compile his letters and speeches. They offer very little insight into the daily, give and take of governance. It's almost as if he existed as a celestial body at the center of a universe, making it incredibly difficult to discern anything else orbiting around him.
Okay, that brings up a crucial question. How is it even possible for one leader to navigate a country of that scale? What does our source tell us about the actual size and complexity of India at the time?
Well, if we consider the sheer scale, in 1951, India was home to over 360 million people, covering more than 3.2 million square kilometers. It operated under a sophisticated federal system encompassing 9 provinces, hundreds of princely states, and centrally administered territories. The British, ironically, had already devolved significant power to Indians at the local levels of governance, and by 1947, a certain habit of, let's say, minor insubordination had already taken root.
Interesting.
And Nehru himself explicitly rejected the notion of being a dictator. He faced constant challenges from within his own government and even party members who openly defied stated policies. When he did intervene, it was typically through persuasion, rarely by pulling rank. If he was defied, he often simply allowed the issue to drop. His plea for temporary retirement in 1958, for example.
Yeah.
That was a clear admission that the workload was simply too vast for one individual.
So if he wasn't this solitary architect working in isolation, what was his actual style of leadership? And how did his image become so extraordinarily larger than life?
Well, he certainly understood his role as a powerful symbol for the Congress Party and for India on the global stage. The party heavily relied on his charisma during the first 3 general elections. His personal attention, for instance, helped ease tensions for Muslims in Hyderabad after the military integration in 1948, the police action.
Right.
He also played a key role in anchoring Jammu and Kashmir to India. Allowing the Jawahar Tunnel to be named after him serves as a good example of this symbolic presence.
Okay.
But there's a distinct difference between being a powerful symbol and actively cultivating an absolute personality cult. The true insight here, I think, is that after his death, the Congress Party, in a strategic effort to maintain unity and legitimacy, significantly expanded the production of Nehru memorabilia. This inadvertently perpetuated the myth of him as the singular architect. A narrative that served their immediate political needs, you see.
That makes sense. Now, the idea of non-alignment. It's practically synonymous with Nehru's foreign policy. It's a concept you hear constantly, but our deep dive suggests this picture is far more complex than simple neutrality. What's the surprising truth here?
It's fascinating because while India indeed refrained from joining Cold War military alliances, its foreign policy was both more intricate and globally ambitious than mere non-alignment implies. The book reveals that non-alignment was often more of an aspirational goal, or perhaps a rhetorical stance, than a foundational material reality. India, despite its independence, was born into a global system already deeply interwoven with the Anglo-American economic and cultural world.
That's a crucial distinction. Can you give us some concrete examples? Just how deeply entangled India was with the Western Bloc, even while championing non-alignment?
Absolutely. Consider military ties. Almost all of India's combat aircraft, tanks, and defense procurement until 1962 originated from the UK, France, or the US.
Really? all of it.
Pretty much. The first truly substantial purchase of Soviet MiG-21s didn't happen until 1962, with deliveries only starting 2 years later in 1964. Even top naval posts in India were held by British officers until as late as 1958.
Wow, 58. Okay.
Economically, the UK and US were India's predominant import and export partners. Together, they accounted for 2/3 of all foreign goods entering the country. Even West Germany played a more significant economic role as a partner and aid donor than the Soviet Union during the Nehru years.
More than the Soviets.
Yeah. By 1965, the United States had provided India with $6.3 billion in aid, while the Soviet Union's contribution amounted to just over $1 billion.
That's truly striking. So if India was so profoundly connected to the West in material terms, what was the strategic purpose behind these consistent proclamations of non-alignment?
That leads us to a crucial point. The rhetoric of non-alignment effectively created the impression, particularly in the U.S., that India was perpetually on the brink of shifting its allegiance towards the Soviet side.
Leverage.
Exactly. Indian diplomats skillfully exploited this perception, leveraging the superpower competition to secure better discounts on arms or competing offers for major development projects like steel mills. Domestically, this rhetoric served to reassure the Indian public that the newly independent nation wasn't simply submitting to a new form of imperial relationship. So the true insight is that non-alignment was a shrewd diplomatic tool. It allowed India to navigate a complex global landscape to its advantage.
Beyond the Cold War dynamic, how else did India engage on the international stage, pushing its vision for a new world order?
India passionately advocated for a vision of one world, playing a significant role in shaping the nascent United Nations. Figures like Nehru's sister, Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, were vocal proponents for the swift end of imperialism and vehemently condemned racialism as a grave human rights violation.
Right.
India also vigorously pressed for the inclusion of less developed countries in the foundational charter of the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, and championed greater global representation within the World Bank.
Okay, let's shift gears. India's secularism, especially during Nehru's era, is often lauded as a fundamental pillar of its national identity. But our deep dives reveals a notable disparity between that noble ideal and the lived reality for many citizens. What did Indian secularism aim to achieve, and where did it ultimately fall short in practice?
Well, post-colonial Indian secularism was indeed entrusted with immense responsibilities. Above all, securing a sense of belonging for religious minorities, particularly Muslims after partition, and simultaneously containing the rise of Hindu nationalism. It also ambitiously aimed at reforming Hinduism itself, which famously led to figures like Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar being placed in charge of both the Constitution and the reform of Hindu personal law.
A huge task.
Immense. The official approach frequently showcased iconic figures. Publications like India's Minorities prominently featured distinguished Muslims, like Brigadier Usman or the film star Nargis, as evidence that minorities were thriving and represented all of India. This emphasis on monumental symbols also extended to public spaces. 1949 stamps depicted landmarks from India's diverse religious history, Buddhist stupas, Muslim mausoleums signaling religious coexistence. Even the Buddha Jayanti celebrations in 1956 were officially sponsored events, cleverly serving as opportunities for international diplomacy.
So we see this grand symbolic representation of secularism.
Yeah.
But what was the everyday experience like, particularly for ordinary Muslims and Dalits? They were supposed to be central to this new inclusive vision, right?
That's where the challenge of intent versus implementation becomes clear. In practice, the bureaucracy often functioned in ways that excluded Muslims. A permit system introduced in 1948 made it exceptionally difficult for Muslims to obtain permission for permanent return to India from Pakistan.
Difficult, huh?
Unlike refugees, which was a euphemism often used for non-Muslims, even Article 7 of the Constitution imposed restrictive conditions on Muslim migrants seeking citizenship. Moreover, constructive evacuees, a term used for Muslims in East Africa deemed loyal to Pakistan, were denied citizenship.
So it wasn't just about crossing the border.
No. And funding for Muslim institutions, like those in Hyderabad after the police action, drastically declined despite Nehru's occasional appeals. Local governments frequently disregarded his interventions. Politically, Muslims lost separate electorates, and any attempts to form their own political parties were often shunned or labeled anti-national. It wasn't until the early 1960s, after a wave of riots and growing dissatisfaction, that leaders like Dr. Syed Mahmood tentatively began to push for more assertive Muslim political organization.
And what about the experience of Dalits, who were also meant to be at the heart of this new secular India?
Well, Ambedkar himself, despite his pivotal role in drafting the Constitution, ultimately resigned from Nehru's cabinet, explicitly citing the neglect of scheduled castes.
He resigned over it.
He did. He even faced violent Congress opposition to his own election to the Constituent Assembly. While untouchability was legally abolished by the Constitution, Dalit members of Parliament, like Mini Mata in 1953, sadly lamented that the abolition had not come into operation in practical form.
So the law was there, but
reality lagged. There was a clear call for legislative change, but also a persistent belief that moral pressure, beyond just law, was truly needed. Perhaps most haunting are incidents like the Ramanathapuram riots in 1957. Dalits were viciously attacked for their votes, and a church where they sought refuge was set on fire.
That's horrific.
An MP chillingly compared it to the black hole of Calcutta and Jallianwala Bagh. The true insight here is that official secularism, while grand in its iconic legislation and celebrated personalities, often left India's most disadvantaged communities struggling with pervasive everyday discrimination and violence.
Let's shift our focus to India's economic path. The prevailing perception is often that Nehruvian socialism meant a highly centralized, almost Stalinist state control over the economy. What does our source material reveal about this particular myth?
Yeah, the idea that Nehru's India operated a Stalinist-style centralized economy is largely inaccurate. India's ambitious 5-year plans were, in reality, more akin to Christmas wish lists, rather than rigid command economy directives, basically. The Planning Commission itself was described as basically advisory. It lacked any real enforcement powers or the resources to directly allocate production. Moreover, the economic model they adopted, import substitution industrialization, trying to make goods at home instead of importing, was actually a model recommended by the U.S. for countries industrializing late.
Recommended by the U.S.? That's surprising.
It is. How did private enterprise actually fit into this supposedly socialist vision?
That's what I was wondering.
Well, private enterprise was, in fact, absolutely crucial. Industrialists were actively encouraged to contribute to national targets. Legislation was designed to instill a sense of corporate social responsibility. The Faridabad township, for instance, was remarkably built by refugee labor cooperatives, signaling a deliberate move away from strict bureaucracy. The government later actively lured private industries to areas like this with concessions and facilities.
So cooperation, not just state control.
Exactly. Nationalization was confined to specific sectors like road transport, airlines in 53, insurance firms in 56, yet private companies often retained control over the most profitable markets. Nehru himself encouraged industrialists not to be frightened of a word like socialism, urging them instead to think of what is good for the people as a whole.
So if it wasn't a rigid command economy, what was the actual impact on economic inequality across the country?
That raises a critical observation. The overall effect of this self-help socialism was quite often to reify and even exacerbate existing inequalities.
Right.
Benefits within corporate towns like Tisco disproportionately went to higher-ranking employees. A large segment of workers continued to live in informal settlements outside. The tanning industry, which got government help and saw profits expand, showed little to no improvement in the abysmal working conditions for Dalit laborers. They still lacked basic protective equipment, basic facilities.
So the profits didn't trickle down?
Not effectively. Even the widespread adoption of bicycles, while a symbol of modernity, actually underscored the increasing spread of inequality. It primarily benefited the rising middle classes. The key insight is that this pragmatic approach to socialism, while aiming for national development, often failed to fundamentally restructure existing social and economic hierarchies.
This also sharply contradicts the notion of a strong centralized state. How does the book challenge that particular myth?
The state he inherited was candidly described as rickety, far from strong or inherently effective. That was the word used. India's leaders were quite critical of the colonial-era police and administration. They saw them as rigid, inefficient, and fundamentally undemocratic. This led to earnest experiments with new administrative structures, often specifically designed to be autonomous and flexible. A prime example is the Central Social Welfare Board, the CSWB, established in 1953 by executive order, bypassing traditional statutes.
Why bypass statutes?
Its explicit purpose was to circumvent rigid government procedures and empower non-officials, particularly women, to lead social welfare initiatives more effectively. get things done faster, perhaps.
And did it work?
Well, the practical reality often diverged significantly. An audit of the CSWB in 1959 was described as damning. It revealed widespread issues like unpaid workers and intense jealousies and rivalries among volunteers.
Not ideal.
Not at all. This ultimately led to the CSWB being absorbed into a ministry and becoming a statutory body, essentially reined back into the central bureaucratic system. The continued use of emergency powers and collective punishments like the punitive police from the colonial era persisted, but these were often a compensation for inherent state weakness and inadequacy, not a sign of intrinsic strength or efficiency. The true insight here is that the Indian state was less a monolith and more a patchwork, constantly experimenting and often struggling to transform its colonial legacy.
Okay, final segment. India's democracy. It's often celebrated as a monumental success, especially given its sheer scale and diversity. But this deep dive suggests that the successful democracy myth is far more nuanced than it appears. It encompasses much more than just the mechanics of elections. What does that mean for our understanding?
Well, while India's elections were undeniably a technical marvel, an intricate constitutional framework, institutions like the Election Commission meticulously designing and adapting a voting system for a massive, often illiterate population.
An incredible feat.
Absolutely. But the founders envisioned democracy as something far grander. It was meant to be a transformative force for society, aiming to diminish the importance of caste and foster individual political and economic interests, truly reshaping the social fabric.
So how did that ambitious transformation actually play out on the ground? Did caste simply fade away from politics as hoped?
Unfortunately, no. The deep dive unequivocally reveals that caste became more, not less, integrated into electoral campaigns.
More integrated.
Yes. Political parties, including the Congress, frequently selected candidates based on caste affiliation, and subtle, indirect appeals to caste loyalties were widespread. Reservations for scheduled castes and tribes, initially conceived as temporary measures, became deeply entrenched, precisely because the broader goal of dissolving caste identity through democracy wasn't realized. Dalit MPs, like B.S. Murthy, clearly articulated that while reservations existed, they hadn't led to genuine representation or an end to the horrific atrocities committed against Dalits.
That also brings us to the pervasive issue of money in politics, a challenge we see in, well, many democracies. What was the situation like in early independent India?
This brings up a critical aspect of economic democracy. It was quickly observed that elections were being worked, as they put it, to align democratic processes with financial influence. There was widespread dismay and concern over corporate donations to political parties and their perceived sway over government decisions.
Like who got permits or licenses?
Exactly. The Santhanam Committee in 1962 famously documented a widespread impression of ministers enriching themselves illegitimately. It highlighted a perceived failure of integrity at high levels. Even Nehru himself expressed personal discomfort accepting donations from businesses.
So this paints a picture of growing internal concerns about the democratic experiment. How did India's leaders try to address these perceived democratic inadequacies from within the system?
By the early 1960s, a robust discourse about India's democratic shortcomings was gaining significant traction. There were persistent calls for reform, not of the fundamental parliamentary system itself, interestingly, but specifically of the behaviors and practices within it.
Reforming behavior, not structure.
Right. For instance, voluntary codes of conduct were drafted for industrial relations and even for political parties, aiming to guide their behavior during elections and in public life. The National Integration Conference in 1961 also directly focused on tackling communal, caste, and linguistic tensions through educational initiatives and economic development. They were explicitly seeking to deepen the habits of democracy rather than merely relying on its formal structures. The true insight here is that India's democracy wasn't a fixed achievement, but a dynamic, contested, and continuously evolving project. Its leaders were keenly aware of its ongoing challenges.
So our deep dive today clearly reveals that Nehru's India was a place of, well, immense complexity and contradiction. It stands in stark contrast to those monolithic, mythic narratives we often hear. We've seen a leader grappling with an unwieldy nation, a foreign policy born of both ambition and pragmatic necessity. Domestic policies struggling to reconcile grand ideals with harsh realities, and a democracy that was constantly in flux and evolving.
It truly underscores that history is rarely, if ever, simple. The challenges of building a nation from scratch are almost unfathomable, and this period was defined by constant experimentation, adaptation, and a relentless interplay of competing ideas, unforeseen circumstances, and human endeavors. It was far from a rigid adherence to a single dogma.
So what does all of this mean for you as someone seeking to be genuinely well-informed?
Well, I think it suggests that the true depth of understanding history comes not from passively accepting simplified stories, but from actively embracing the nuances, embracing the inherent contradictions and the continuous striving for improvement that characterized India's foundational years. It encourages a deeper, maybe more empathetic engagement with the past.
It's a powerful reminder, isn't it? To truly grasp history, we must continually question our assumptions and dig deeper, recognizing that even the most celebrated narratives contain layers of complexity just waiting to be uncovered. That's all for this deep dive. We hope you'll continue to explore the rich and complex history of India and perhaps even challenge a few more myths along the way.